now continuing his never-ending screed against black athletes. Basically, it's you know, people of color seem to be the or athletes who are people of color seem to be basically the only recipients slash victims of his tirades. This morning he called LeVar Ball, the father of LaAngelo Ball, who was one of the UCLA basketball players busted in China for shoplifting, called him an ungrateful fool and a poor man's version of Don King. Remember Don King, the black boxing promoter? Yeah. Leave it to Trump. Such, you know, stay classy, Donald. Stay classy. Incredible. Today is the anniversary of the assassination of Jack Kennedy. Lamar Waldron and I wrote 2 books about this, one called Legacy of Secrecy. In fact, I think I have them here. Oh, yeah. The other one, Ultimate Sacrifice, John and Robert Kennedy, the plan for a coup in Cuba and the murder of JFK. And a special tip of the hat to Liz Smith, who died on November 12th. She was 94 years old. She really helped us promote this. And, well, it wasn't so much us. I mean, she was just all over the topic. And every time Lamar and I made a discovery, AM World, Commander Juan Almeida and his work for John Kennedy, the Camtex FBI operation that actually got Carlos Marcello to confess on tape to organizing the murder of John Kennedy. And, you know, and Jack Van Lanningham was his cellmate and did that on behalf of the FBI. And Jack is still alive and willing to tell his story. In fact, we tell it in our books, and Lamar in his new book, The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination. So just a heads up. Net neutrality protests are going to be happening. I mentioned this yesterday. I want to mention it again because I think that there's a larger context, a larger frame here. And that is that we're looking at a process. This is the gradual, but in this case, it's happening fairly rapidly. I mean, this is happening over a period of a decade or so. Arguably, it started happening in 1971 with Lewis Powell's memo to Eugene Sindor, the chairman or president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and that letter has been referred to as the Powell memo, in which Powell said, you know, corporations, businesses, rich people need to start getting politically active. Up until that point, it was considered unpatriotic for a corporation to engage itself in politics because corporations have so much financial power that everybody understood that they could twist politics to their advantage, you know, to their goals, to their ends. And therefore, it was highly inappropriate for corporations to be involved in politics. But in '71, Lewis Powell argued strongly and forcefully to some of the wealthiest people in America, you've got to get politically active. And they did. In the '70s, they started the Heritage Foundation. The Charles Koch Foundation was renamed as the Cato Institute. You know, within a decade and a half, 2 decades, you had Fox News. Right-wing hate radio really started in '87, again, in large part as a consequence of the Powell memo, in my opinion. And then Lewis Powell in '72, Nixon put him on the U.S. Supreme Court, and thus in 1976, in the Buckley versus Vallejo case, he ruled and wrote the opinion that giving money to politicians, that when billionaires and corporations who make them rich give money to politicians, that's not considered a bribe. That's considered free speech, protected by the First Amendment of the United States. So Citizens United began, it didn't really begin, it put on steroids, it certified, it ratified, it turned into an industry, the purchasing of politicians, particularly Republican politicians. Republicans fully embraced this. In a similar way, we're watching this move for net neutrality. Ajit Pai, the former Verizon lawyer, who now is the head of the FCC, moving to destroy net neutrality in just a few weeks. And there are going to be protests at Verizon stores all over the country. Demand Progress, Fight for the Future, Free Press Action Network, FightForTheFuture.org is really kind of leading this. This is going to be 2 weeks from Thanksgiving, December 7th, if I'm doing the calendar in my head correctly. Currently, there are protests planned for Phoenix, Denver, San Francisco, New York City, Indianapolis, Boston, and other cities around the country. There's going to be a special event in D.C. The Free Press Action Fund director, Mary Alice Krim, said, while FCC Chairman Ajit Pai has been busy meeting with industry lobbyists and greedy Verizon executives, he should not ignore the millions of Americans who are joining together to reject his bill to kill off net neutrality. Mark Stanley, director of communications at Demand Progress, said Americans are sick and tired of lawmakers placing the profits of monopolistic companies like Verizon and Comcast ahead of the interests of ordinary people. Well, that's exactly what's happening. And you want to see what happens when you end net neutrality? Look at China. Piece in the New York Times yesterday, the headline, Skype vanishes from app stores in China, including Apple's, by Paul Moser. For almost a month, Skype has been unavailable on a number of sites where apps are downloaded in China, including Apple's own App Store. Apple has said to the dictators of China, sure, no problem, we'll do whatever you want, just keep making us money. This disruption began in late October, according to Paul Moser in the New York Times. While China has long wielded the most sophisticated, he writes, and comprehensive internet controls in the world, under President Xi Jinping, it has upped the ante, squelching most foreign social networks and messaging apps one at a time. They've taken down Gmail, Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, Telegram, and Line. Beijing appears to have disabled these apps because they generally feature encryption options that make messages harder for the government to monitor. Well, wait until it's just your ISP trying to monitor it. It might let you use more apps because, after all, they're your ISP. They can read absolutely everything you do unless you're trying to use a VPN, in which case they're going to throttle you, or at least Comcast used to do that to me, presumably to everybody else. The move is a reminder of how beholden Apple has become to the Chinese government. Last year, it said it had complied with a request from the Chinese authorities to remove apps created by the New York Times from its China App Store. So the way I've characterized this up to this point is like corporations are going to censor you here in the United States. The government is going to censor you there in China. But the reality is far grayer. It's actually a middle ground that includes the horror, the freak show of both of those scenarios. Because these corporations now have bought control of our government. Even though only a very small percentage of Americans actually want net neutrality to be destroyed, actually want Comcast, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, whatever, to be able to censor what you see on the internet, to provide you with content that's profitable to them at high speed and content that might be detrimental to them or even contradict their official lines at very low speed or even block them altogether. The majority of Americans don't want that. But our FCC, the Trump administration, the Republicans in Congress are perfectly willing to give that to us, to stick us with that, because they're being paid off by these big internet service providers. Another example of the Republican Party putting profits, money, and power, political power, ahead of what's right and what's good for America and Americans. These people don't give a damn about the United States of America. They want their profits coming out of China. They want their profits to be stored in bank accounts in Panama and Switzerland and the Bahamas. They don't give a rat's ass about you or me. And that's what's going on. Meanwhile, the same thing, another form of fascism. Now it's the petro industry, the fossil fuel industry, buying off Republicans so that the EPA is censoring climate change. I'll tell you about that right after the break. But it's basically a variation on doing away with net neutrality. You're going to see the exact same thing. This is fascism in motion.